Hello, this is Ruben with Run Wild Powersports, and today we are testing the Honda Talon. We have a hub dyno over here at H Car in San Antonio, and we're going to be testing the different tunes to see which one of them makes the most power, the most linear power, and this is the first part of a two-part series. The second part, we're going to take this to the road with a draggy, and we're going to look at the acceleration times on it. We hope you enjoy this, and we'll help you in deciding which tune you want to put on your machine. Thank you. Stay tuned. So we're back here in the shop after we've done those dyno pools on this Honda Talon 1000. So a little bit about this machine. The two modifications that we do have on this machine over stock is a slip-on EVO exhaust, and then we have the Pwr Tune throttle body plate that's a little bigger than stock. Other than that, stock air filter, everything else is stock on it. We are running 93 octane fuel in it because many of these, like Hess, Pwr Tune, they require at least 91 octane. So we have 93 octane in here because that's available to us. As far as the companies go, as we make our way down, we're going to fill in this chart with the horsepower and the torque numbers. But right off the bat, we can look at the one number that you can get off of any of their websites, and that's the cost of the tune. So no matter which company you go with, you're going to have to source a DynoJet PV3 in order to load the tune onto the PV3 and then onto the machine. So Kops, Hess, and Pwr Tune, all three of those companies, you're able to get that DynoJet PV3 from, as well as directly from DynoJet. That being said, this cost right here is only for the tune. That's the number that we can look at because that sets the playing field pretty level. So for Kops, the tune comes in at $350. For Florida Cracker Performance, it comes in at $100. Hess, if you bring your own PV3, it's $150 or $100 if you source your PV3 from them. Pwr Tune is $100 for their tune. However, Pwr Tune, they have several different tunes. They have stock, exhaust with the intake mod, several different options. If you source your DynoJet from Pwr Tune for $100 on top of the DynoJet PV3, you get all 6 tunes from them. And so the other thing to note is Kops and Florida Cracker Performance, both of those companies, they do not have a dyno. So these guys are very knowledgeable and they are looking at the logs and they're running and adjusting those numbers based on the logs of the machines that they are loading these tunes on. So they make sure that the tune is not only very safe and reliable, but also has the performance gains that some of the other tunes would have. Hess and Pwr Tune actually have in-house dynos that they use for these tunes. Now we're going to see if that makes a difference as we go through the different tuners. So to start it off, we want to start with the stock numbers. So let's take a look at the dyno pool for the stock tune, and let's see what kind of numbers it puts up. Get a good baseline. So we have our first pool in the books, and looking at the numbers, we see 91.92 horsepower and 69.95 foot-pounds of torque. So this is about in line with the stock machine. Stock machine has 105 horsepower advertised at the crank. And so going through the drivetrain, we do see about 10 or 15% loss, and that's about in line with the numbers we see here. Sometimes the stock horsepower numbers are a little lower, around 87 to 89 horsepower. We see a little bit higher here, and that may be due to the throttle body plate and the slip-on exhaust. So a stock machine may see a little bit lower numbers here baseline. So keep that in mind as we go down the numbers, that we're starting with a baseline that may be a little higher than stock because of the modifications that we have on this machine even before we loaded a tune. So the first one up on deck is Kops. Let's take a look at their pool and then their numbers after. so now we have our first tune on the board, and looking at cops, it produced 93.11 horsepower and 70.75 foot-pounds of torque. So we see almost 1 foot-pound of torque increase on the torque, and then as far as the horsepower, again, maybe 1 1/4, a little less than 1 1/4 horsepower increase. So let's just make our way down the list. Let's go to FCP, see what kind of numbers they put up on the board. All right, so now we have the FCP run done, and looking at the board, we increased a little bit over cops and over the stock to 93.75 horsepower, and then torque we went up to 71.02, so maybe about a quarter foot-pounds of torque, and then over stock about 1 foot-pound of torque. Again, nothing ridiculously crazy, but let's keep making our way down the line. We have Hess up next. Let's take a look at their pool. All right, we're making our way pretty quickly through these pools. We have Hess up next on the board, and horsepower wise, 93.72, roughly about the same. But the torque, we went up. We went to 71.34 on the torque side. So we're making our way up over stock. We're about a foot and a half, uh, foot and a half pound, foot 1.5 foot-pounds of torque up over stock. Horsepower, we're still sitting around the same range we were there. Now let's go to Pwr Tune. Let's see what kind of numbers we get from them. All right, so we have the last number on the board here, the run from Pwr Tune, and we can see there's 93.74 horsepower and 71.35 foot-pounds of torque. It's very similar to the Hess tune, which makes sense. Again, both of these companies have in-house dynos that they're using to tweak their tune. So it would make sense that these two companies are very close to both their horsepower and their foot-pounds of torque. Now, it may not look like there's a big difference to stock here, but one thing I want you to keep in mind is this isn't a 100% stock machine. We do have the throttle body plate that increases the bore several millimeters that we got from Pwr Tune, and then we do have a slip-on EVO exhaust. So the stock numbers may be closer to the mid 80s, mid to upper 80s, and so if we just take that into account, we may see a little bit higher of an increase on the horsepower range. There would be a disparity there, but being that we already have an exhaust on there, that maybe doesn't show up in these numbers. That being said, these dyno numbers are only a part of the whole thing. It's always cool to have more horsepower and more foot-pounds of torque, but what really sets apart any of these tunes is the throttle response, is the way that it handles the timing and the fuel injection, how much fuel is in there, the shift points, the slipping of the clutches. All of those things are things that come into play whenever you are in mud, in sand, in rocks, in cruising. those are all things that these companies will take into account when they're building a tune. So this is only part of the story. This is part one. This video is part one. We're taking this vehicle over to Moab this coming week, where we're going to actually test these tunes with our draggy, and we're going to see what kind of acceleration numbers they have. And I think at that point, we're going to start to see some clear differences between the tunes. Whereas right now on the dyno numbers, at least, we're not seeing a huge difference between all of these tunes. That being said, I invite you to reach out to these companies, talk to them directly. These are things that we see on the dyno, but they can give you more background as far as how they build a tune, what technology they're using, whether or not a company like Hess, they're heavy, heavy, heavy into Talon racing. Pwr Tune is very heavy into racing as well, as are some of these. And so it's very important for you to talk to these tuners and find out how much of what you want your machine to do aligns with the way that they build the tunes and they run their companies. That's very important for you to build a long relationship with these companies as your machine evolves and you get more modifications on those machines. So again, stick with us as we go over to part two in the coming week. We're taking this machine to Moab. We're going to have some great time. We're going to do a lot of testing. We'll hopefully have a lot of video to share with you. And please make sure and subscribe. Thank you. Thank you for sticking with us throughout the video and looking at the numbers and the dyno pools that we did on this machine. I want to make a little disclaimer here at the end just so that I can address some of the potential questions that may come up as we look at these numbers. One of the things that I want to stress is that if you look at some of the websites like Pwr Tune or Hess, they will give specific dyno numbers for the mods that we have on this machine, as well as their tunes that might be at odds with here. And one isn't necessarily right and one wrong. I want to stress that because there are a lot of differences between dynos, between atmospheric pressure levels in different parts of the country, gasoline in the machines. There's many variables. So there's typically a percentage between 1 and 3, sometimes even up to 5% variances for even the same machine across multiple dynos across on different parts of the country. So I think the numbers are pretty in line with what we're seeing on the companies that actually have dynos and are actually putting out the numbers. I think these numbers are pretty accurate if we were to go to another part of the country, use another dyno, and we're to run these same, we'd see this same spread. Again, the stock one I think is a little inflated just because we do have a couple of modifications on this machine already. In the future, we will get another stock, 100% stock machine in and you know, run some of these same tests. The other thing that I want to talk about is the gains that we're seeing here are again in line with what we see across not even just Powersports, but in the automotive industry. So when we have a naturally aspirated car with no power adder like a turbocharger or a supercharger, we can see again 2 to 4% gain. That's about what we can expect from a decent tune. A lot of these motors already have a good amount of their power pulled out from the factory. And so getting a 2 to 4% gain is about what you can expect. So I don't think these numbers are anything to be disappointed about. And then lastly, these numbers tell literally one part of 100 different parts that make these machines better with these tunes. So all we're looking at here is raw data on horsepower and torque as compared to stock. And all that is cool. We like to see high horsepower numbers on here. But what really makes a difference is the other things that I mentioned earlier in the video. Like shift points and clutch engagement. Those things make a real big difference when you're actually driving the machine out on the street. And what I wanted to show you is if we have a power curve, and if you look at the dyno readings on our website, you'll see the power curves for all of these compared to stock. And on stock, the red line is 8,400 RPM, and on some of these, it's a little over 9,000 RPM. Now, we saw that about 8,400 RPM is where these machines make their peak power. So the fact that these companies go past that and continue in in that gear until they're shifting to another gear, that is something that actually contributes to the vehicle being faster. And the way that I can explain it is, if this power curve is like this, so right here is about 8,400 RPM and it's making the most horsepower, stock would change gears and then drop down to, say, right here in the next gear in the power curve. Whereas over here on, say, the Power Tune, say they shift at 9,200 and then now in the next gear they stay here. So we're seeing this drop right here in power. And so versus over here with Power Tune, say, and I'm using Power Tune as an example, but really it applies to everybody. You stay higher in that power curve as you're driving the machine. And so it isn't so much about horsepower increases as it is about staying inside of that power curve. And so whenever you look at these companies, those shift points are very important, because then you're going to stay in the power range. And there's, again, a slew of other things that contribute to the benefit of having one of these tunes. The last thing I want you to do is look at the negligible increase over stock and think that these tunes are a waste of money. They absolutely are not a waste of money. This is something that I would suggest is the first thing that anybody does to their machine, is get something that makes their machine operate more efficiently. And so, again, we're gonna take this machine to Moab next week, and we're gonna put it on the test. We're gonna road test it, and you're gonna start to see these differences that aren't reflected in the horsepower numbers. So I hope you stick with us for part two, and let's see what kind of numbers that we get.